The transformation of the Jedi Order from a diplomatic and spiritual institution into a military command structure occurred at the onset of the Clone Wars and represented one of the most abrupt institutional shifts in Galactic Republic history. Prior to the conflict, canonical sources depict the Jedi as mediators who operated outside the Republic chain of command, functioning primarily as neutral arbiters. Their defined role involved conflict de-escalation, investigation, and negotiation. When the clone army appeared on Kamino, the Senate assumed without formal debate that the Jedi would adapt to battlefield leadership, demonstrating a structural reclassification of their institutional identity rather than a negotiated role change. The Senate's emergency session in Attack of the Clones established the legal framework enabling this shift. Through the conferral of emergency powers to Chancellor Palpatine, the Senate authorized rapid deployment of a military force. The legislative record shown in the film suggests no procedural consideration of how the Jedi should integrate with this new army. Instead, the Jedi were designated commanding officers by default. The transition was not accompanied by strategic evaluations, operational training provisions, or institutional guidelines. The lack of procedural planning indicates that the Senate viewed the Jedi not as an independent order, but as a pre-existing asset suitable for military use. The Jedi Council's acceptance of this assignment further reinforced the reclassification. In canonical scenes, the Council raises concerns about the army's origin, but not about the political implications of assuming military authority. Their response illustrates an internal assumption that service to the Republic encompassed obedience to Senate directives, regardless of functional alignment with Jedi doctrine. This compliance eliminated any opportunity for institutional resistance, allowing the Senate's interpretation of the Jedi's role to override centuries of established practice. The public response, as inferred from canonical material, demonstrates widespread acceptance of the Jedi's new role. Media within the Clone Wars series reports battles with Jedi generals at the forefront, implying that the civilian population did not question the sudden militarization of the Order. This acceptance reflects a structural reliance on Jedi authority during times of crisis. The cultural perception of the Jedi as protectors facilitated the Senate's reassignment of function without provoking public scrutiny. The Republic's strategic motivation for assigning command roles to the Jedi was grounded in practicality rather than doctrinal compatibility. The Jedi possessed advanced situational perception, rapid decision-making skills, and combat proficiency, all of which the Senate interpreted as qualifications for military leadership. However, these attributes stemmed from defensive training and spiritual practice rather than formal command instruction. Their reassignment assumed functional equivalence between individual combat skill and large-scale strategic leadership, an assumption not supported by canonical evidence of Jedi training. The Senate's reliance on Jedi leadership served a symbolic function as well. A Jedi general conveyed legitimacy, order, and continuity at a time of political destabilization. Visual sequences in the films repeatedly framed Jedi commanders at the center of military operations, reinforcing the image of the war as a morally justified endeavor. This symbolic role compensated for gaps in the Republic's institutional cohesion and allowed the Senate to present military escalation as ethically grounded. The Jedi's participation in military command altered their relationship to the Republic. Before the war, they operated as advisors independent of political directives. After mobilization, their authority became tied to Senate decisions, emergency powers, and battlefield outcomes. Canonical interactions between Palpatine and the Council demonstrate this dependence. The Chancellor's influence over deployments and strategic decisions increased significantly, creating a structural hierarchy in which the Jedi no longer functioned as autonomous agents. The reclassification of the Jedi as military personnel had measurable effects on their internal governance. Council meetings depicted throughout the Clone Wars shift from discussions of ethical or spiritual matters to tactical planning and resource allocation. The administrative load associated with military campaigns redirected attention away from doctrinal, maintenance, mentorship, and archival oversight. This functional shift weakened institutional continuity and diluted the Order's traditional responsibilities. Youngling instruction also suffered structural disruption. Canon episodes show instructors dedicating time to wartime logistics or battlefield assignments, reducing the stability of training environments. Initiates were exposed to wartime ideology and normalizations of violence that contradicted pre-existing Jedi pedagogy. The Senate's implicit assumption that Jedi could maintain traditional practices while performing military duties proved incompatible with the demands of sustained conflict. The use of Jedi as generals accelerated the Order's integration into political disputes previously outside its domain. Decisions regarding troop movement, casualty management, and regional occupations positioned the Jedi within debates about Republic authority. Their participation in these disputes reduced the perceived neutrality of the Order. Senate members, such as those depicted in the Clone Wars, began to view the Jedi as political actors rather than impartial advisors. The clone command structure reinforced this perception. Standardized protocols treated the Jedi as senior officers. Scenes in which clone captains and commanders addressed Jedi as superiors demonstrate this formalization of hierarchy. Although the clones expressed respect, their obedience indicated that the Republic had institutionalized the Jedi's military authority. The Senate's assignment became codified through daily battlefield interactions, making reversal of the shift increasingly unlikely. The reclassification also exposed the Jedi to vulnerabilities associated with military dependence. Because clones executed battlefield strategies under Jedi leadership, operational outcomes were attributed to the Order. Canonical episodes show senators criticizing the Jedi for failed campaigns or collateral damage. This shifting narrative eroded public trust and provided a pretext for later political actions against them. The Senate's decision to treat the Jedi as military leaders enabled such criticism to gain traction. Palpatine's manipulation of the war further exploited the Jedi's new role. As the Senate expanded his emergency powers, he acquired increasingly direct control over military operations. This structural consolidation limited the Council's influence. Scenes in Revenge of the Sith depict the Jedi expressing concern about Palpatine's authority, yet their military obligations constrained their ability to challenge him. Their position as generals placed them within the Chancellor's chain of command, weakening institutional independence. The war's duration intensified these pressures. Sustained deployments stretched Jedi resources across numerous fronts, reducing Council oversight and fragmenting communication networks. Canonical accounts show knights dispersed throughout the galaxy, unable to coordinate doctrine or maintain communal stability. This decentralization undermined the Order's internal cohesion, a condition directly linked to the Senate's initial decision to assign them military authority. The militarization of the Jedi produced immediate structural consequences that reshaped the Order's internal functioning and degraded the philosophical framework that had defined it for centuries. Canonical sources illustrate that the Jedi did not possess the institutional capacity to operate as wartime commanders. Their temples, training systems, and governing bodies were designed for diplomatic missions and spiritual development, not prolonged military campaigns. As the war's scope expanded, the Order's organizational structure proved unable to adapt without compromising its foundational principles. Once the Jedi assumed command of clone battalions, their decision-making paradigm shifted from conflict resolution to conflict management. Tactical deployments replaced negotiation efforts, and strategic planning superseded contemplative practice. This shift is visible across the Clone Wars series, where Council meetings focus on military logistics rather than mediation or doctrinal oversight. The Senate's reclassification of the Jedi fundamentally altered their institutional priorities, creating misalignment between operational obligations and philosophical mandates. The new command role forced the Jedi into continuous engagement with violence. Canonical depictions across the conflict showed Jedi participating in offensive campaigns, siege operations, and covert strikes. These activities contradicted their stated commitment to non-aggression, but their military responsibilities required frequent engagement in lethal force. This contradiction generated internal strain and blurred the distinction between Jedi intervention and Republic warfare, reducing the clarity of the Order's identity. Clone forces relied on the Jedi for strategic guidance, which required the Order to maintain constant battlefield presence. Canon episodes depict knights and masters leading operations on dozens of fronts simultaneously, demonstrating how the Council's oversight capacity became overstretched. The decentralization of authority weakened internal communication and produced doctrinal inconsistencies, as individual Jedi adopted pragmatic approaches tailored to battlefield necessity rather than institutional philosophy. The militarization also generated long-term dependence on clone infrastructure. Tactical reliance on clone intelligence, reconnaissance, and logistics gradually shifted practical authority away from the Jedi. Officers such as Captain Rex, Commander Cody, and others assumed significant operational roles, effectively standardizing military procedure regardless of Jedi involvement. This integration confined the Jedi within a military hierarchy controlled by the Senate and, ultimately, by Chancellor Palpatine. The Senate's continuous expansion of wartime authority compounded these issues. Emergency powers enabled the Chancellor to override Council recommendations, redirect military assets, and influence battlefield priorities. Scenes in Revenge of the Sith highlight the Council's concern about this erosion of autonomy, yet their military status deprived them of leverage. Their institutional legitimacy had become tied to Senate approval, eliminating their ability to dissent without appearing insubordinate. As the war progressed, the Jedi's public perception shifted from impartial mediators to political actors. Civilians and senators increasingly associated the Order with military actions, as depicted in episodes involving public criticism of the Jedi's conduct. Their symbolic role as guardians of peace diminished as battle reports framed them as combat leaders. This change in perception facilitated political narratives that portrayed the Jedi as contributors to instability rather than stabilizing forces. The Order's involvement in controversial operations further damaged its reputation. Missions involving collateral damage, tactical errors, or civilian casualties, events documented in several Clone Wars episodes, were attributed to Jedi oversight. Since they held command authority, the public associated these outcomes with Jedi decision-making, rather than Senate directives or military necessity. The Senate capitalized on these perceptions to justify increased oversight and critique. Philosophical integrity also deteriorated as the Jedi increasingly adopted utilitarian reasoning. Doctrinal teachings prioritizing non-attachment, restraint, and passive defense were repeatedly compromised by battlefield demands. Instructors redirected youngling education toward war-oriented competencies, and Padawans were assigned to active combat roles. These adjustments reflect an institutional shift away from spiritual development and toward functional militarization. The Jedi's new role also made them vulnerable to targeted political manipulation. The Senate and the Chancellor controlled access to intelligence, deployments, and resources. By dictating military assignments, Palpatine placed Jedi in scenarios designed to weaken their public standing or induce strategic failure. Canonical plotlines demonstrate how selective information and manipulated crises undermined the Council's confidence and coherence. The war accelerated generational disruption within the Order. Many senior Jedi were deployed to the front lines, leaving fewer experienced masters available for governance or mentorship. Canonical evidence shows that knights assumed responsibilities traditionally reserved for council members, creating structural instability. Apprentices were assigned to active duty prematurely, which diluted the pedagogical depth of Jedi training. The Jedi's inability to advocate for alternative conflict solutions further entrenched their military identity. Repeated attempts to negotiate ceasefires or peace initiatives were obstructed by separatist sabotage or Senate reluctance. This dynamic forced the Jedi to maintain military commitments, even when diplomatic options briefly emerged. Their inability to shift the Republic toward negotiation reinforced the perception that war was their primary function. The psychological impact of prolonged combat is reflected in various Jedi character arcs, where individuals exhibit signs of moral fatigue, strategic frustration, or diminished doctrinal clarity. These developments underscore that the Order lacked institutional systems to address the mental and philosophical strain produced by continuous warfare. The Senate's expectations ignored these limitations, further accelerating organizational decline. The functional collapse of Jedi autonomy became evident when the Council attempted to investigate Palpatine. Because they operated as military officers under his chain of command, their inquiry was interpreted as insubordination rather than legitimate oversight. This structural disadvantage allowed Palpatine to frame the Jedi as traitors during Order 66. Their militarized status made such framing credible to clone forces and the civilian population. Order 66 demonstrated that the Senate's decision to militarize the Jedi created systemic vulnerabilities. As generals, the Jedi were embedded within clone battalions whose loyalty was to the Chancellor. When the order was issued, the clones executed their commands without deliberation. The Jedi's legally and functionally defined role as military leaders rendered them susceptible to immediate removal without institutional recourse. The overall collapse of the Jedi Order was not solely the result of external manipulation, but also of structural consequences initiated by the Senate's overnight reclassification. By assigning them a military identity, the Senate dismantled their philosophical foundation, compromised their neutrality, and placed them within a hierarchy designed for eventual replacement. The militarization did not merely alter their duties, it reshaped their identity in a manner incompatible with long-term institutional survival.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.